Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It is good to see everyone, and please accept my apology for being late. We were taking a tour and we got caught up. But nevertheless, we're here. And we're here to talk about a fairly important issue, topic that's near and dear and close to my heart, and certainly to all of you in the room. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, right? I have the distinct honor today of facilitating a conversation among these two. I'll introduce them in a few moments, but let me start by saying a few words. Black History Month is an annual observance originated in the U.S., where it is also known as African American History Month. It has received official recognition in not only the U.S., but Canada and the U.K. It began as a way of remembering important people and events in history around people of African descent in the diaspora. It's celebrated in February in the U.S. and Canada, while in Ireland and the U.K. it is observed in October. How many of you knew that? So actually, if you're a traveler, you can celebrate it twice a year. Just take a trip, right? Negro History Week began in 1926 by a gentleman named Professor Carter G. Woodson, and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History announced the second week of February to be Negro History Week. The week was chosen because it coincided with the birthday of Abraham Lincoln on February 12th, and then Frederick Douglass on February 14th, both of which black communities had celebrated since the late 19th century, the history of black people. Its initial emphasis was placed on encouraging the coordinated teaching of the history of black Americans in our nation's public schools. At the time of Negro History Week launch, Woodson contended that the teaching of black history was essential to ensure the physical and intellectual survival of blacks within broader society. If a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. Throughout the 1930s, Negro History Week countered the growing myth of the South's lost cause, quote unquote, which argued that enslaved people had been well treated, that the Civil War was a war of Northern aggression, and that black people had been better off under slavery. Negro History Week grew in popularity throughout the following decades as mayors across the U.S. endorsed it as a holiday. In 1970, Black History Month, Black history educators and Black United Citizens at Kent State University, and it is often the case that students lead the rest of society, right? Students at Kent State University first proposed Black History Month in February 1969. The first celebration of Black History Month took place at Kent State a year later, from January 2nd until February 28th. Now, if you were counting, they started with 2 months. Interesting. 6 years later, Black History Month was being celebrated all across the country in educational institutions, centers of black culture, and community centers, both great and small, when President Gerald Ford recognized Black History Month in 1976 during the celebration of the U.S. bicentennial. He urged Americans to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. Today, Black History Month is celebrated across the nation and the world and continues to honor the historic contributions of Africans around the world. Many corporations commemorate it today as well. That is to say, the month has become capitalized. Today, we are honored to have our panelist, the first of whom is our newly appointed Chancellor of the SUNY system, Dr. John King. Thank you, Chancellor, for being here today and for sharing your thoughts on the importance of Black History Month. Next, we have our very own. Well, we're going to claim the Chancellor too, right? Right. So you're our very own as well, all right? Didn't want you to feel left out, right?
Thank you.
Next, we have our very own Dr. Danielle Lee, who had... She is an assistant professor in English and a cherished member and leader in our SUNY or Westbury community. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for being on today's panel and for sharing your thoughts on the importance of Black history as well. As a special note, although she's not here, I would like to acknowledge that our chair of the Board of Trustees was with us for half the day as well. She's left because she didn't want to share the spotlight. She wanted to give it all to our Chancellor. But you should also know that she really, really cherishes SUNY Westbury and was happy to be here yet again. And finally, we have you, our students, staff, and faculty of SUNY Westbury. I want to welcome you to this opportunity and timely discussion. It is a really important discussion, and I want to thank you for being here, as well as thanking the organizers of today's not only visit, but today's conversation with the Chancellor, as well as the chair's visit. So thank you to all of you who made today's activities possible. So this is going to be real simple. I'm just going to ask questions and they're going to answer it. We're going to move quickly so that you can ask questions as well. For today's discussion, I've prepared 5 questions for you that are designed to prompt you to expound upon as you see fit. Okay? Our first question takes us back to what I read a few moments ago. And I read, at the time of Negro History Week launch, founder Dr. Carter G. Woodson contended that the teaching of Black history was essential to ensure the physical and intellectual survival of Blacks within broader society. He said, if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. These were Dr. Woodson's sentiments and words back in the 1920s. How relevant do you feel his words are today in 2023, and why?
Defer to you.
Why, thank you, Chancellor. So, microphone checking. The teaching of Black history, the teaching of any history of people that have experienced or are part of the diaspora, is about voice. It's about visibility. Marginalized communities are made invisible. If we don't know their history, we don't know about their existence, their thoughts, their feelings, their practices, what they believed in. If we don't teach Black history, we're also not teaching American history. We're not teaching global history. We're not teaching international history, transatlantic history, the list goes on. So to deny an education or a discussion about Black history is to deny a significant part of our world. The diaspora and the hybridity between the colonizer and the colonized is that we have an exchange of practices, we have an exchange of language, of belief. So to shut that down is to inherently shut down or give us the message that who we are does not matter. That is at the crux of what I like to call of Black Lives Mattering. The Black Lives Matter movement is not new. It started with the abolitionist movement, and prior to that, when we are trying to prove that Africans have feelings, have family systems, have intellect. We get to the Harlem Renaissance. We have artists, we have writers, we have playwrights. To not teach a history is to keep a people silenced, and therefore to erase them, and to put them in a state of alterity or subaltern state that no one deserves to be in. Our voice, our history is who makes us, what makes us, but also helps us plan for a future that looks better and brighter and is more plausible, and is more accepting and inclusive of all identities and all histories, because we're all connected just as human beings.
Maybe it was a mistake to go second.
I should have warned you. I'm sorry.
It's hard to follow that. First, let me say thank you, President Sams, and thank you, Professor Lee, for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I think Professor Lee very powerfully captured why this history is so important. I won't try to add to that so much as I'll share a story that I think illustrates this. And it's a personal story about my family history. So when I was United States Secretary of Education for President Obama, I was invited to give the commencement address at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, because my grandmother had graduated from UMES in 1894. One of the earliest graduates of the institution, one of the earliest black women graduates from higher education. And so I was invited to give the commencement address, and I thought, well, for the commencement address, I ought to do some family history research to prepare for the speech. So I started down this project, the path of a project to research family history, and through a friend, got connected with a genealogist who'd worked at the Schomburg, the part of the New York City Public Library that focuses on studying African American history. And she offered to help with this project. And so we started digging into my family history. And we'd always known there was some connection to Maryland, which is where I was living when I was serving in the administration. Knew, as many African Americans do, that there was a connection to the institution of slavery, but didn't have more detail than that. One night, I got an email from this genealogist saying, I've located the property where your family was enslaved. The property where my great-grandfather was enslaved. And she said, not only that, I've located the property and it is 25 miles from where you live.
Wow.
So I was living in Silver Spring, Maryland. The property's in Gaithersburg, Maryland. So not only that, the property is still owned to this day by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved your family. And here's a visual of the property. The cabin that your great-grandfather and his mother and siblings lived in as enslaved people is still standing on the property. And so then we had this whole conversation as a family. What do we do with this information? And of course wanted to see the property, but then thought, do you send an email? do you call? Like, how do you begin that conversation, right? And so we were just trying to figure out how to start the conversation. And my cousin happened to be visiting a few weeks later the Smithsonian African American History Museum, the new Smithsonian Museum, and they have enslaved people's quarters in the museum. And so when she saw that, she got inspired to just go. And so she went to the property, knocked on the door, said, my ancestors lived here.
Wow.
And that started a conversation between our two families that has been truly extraordinary about our shared history. And having the opportunity to stand with my wife and my daughters inside of that cabin, it's hard to describe the emotions of that. The cabin is not 30 feet from the main house. So when you're standing inside of the cabin, you are deeply conscious of the incredible intimacy and cruelty of the institution of slavery. Right? These were two families living in the same physical space, one owning the other. And I'm very conscious that I'm only alive today because my ancestors survived, right? Because they lived with faith in a future they could not see. I have the opportunity to be here in this moment. But the other thing I think about when I'm standing inside of that cabin is how profound it is that in my family we went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first black president. And so for me, Black History Month, the study of African American history is about understanding who we are as Americans. the hard parts, the ugly parts, the painful parts, and the progress, right? Those are both an important part of our story. And as an African American, I don't think I could fully appreciate who I am, how I came to be here if I didn't understand that history. But for all Americans, I don't think we can fully understand who we are as a people if we don't appreciate and deeply understand the journey of African American history. Yeah.
That was probably the best follow-up you could have had after Dr. Lee, right? He killed it, right? The next question is, in light of the attacks in Florida, y'all knew it was coming, right? Right? And if I hadn't asked, some of you would have asked, right? Mandy shaking her head. In light of the attacks in Florida on teaching advanced placement African American history, what do you believe to be the real concerns about teaching Black history to Floridians and Americans? What are the real concerns there?
You know, Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard African American historian, and really one of the, I think, preeminent scholars of African American history in the country, just had an op-ed in the New York Times, I think maybe this weekend, about the connection between what's happening in Florida and the lost cause history that you referenced, President Sams, right? After the Civil War, when Reconstruction happened and we had the adoption of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, we had the first African Americans elected to Congress, we had the first opportunities to create African American higher education institutions. I mean, there was tremendous progress in that period immediately after the Civil War. And in reaction to that, the Lost Cause movement tried to rewrite the history of the Confederacy, to glorify the Confederacy, and to tell a story about the Civil War and about our history as a country, which is false. Right? To claim that somehow the Confederacy was heroically standing up for states' rights, and to try to undermine African American history and the progress of Reconstruction. And that movement largely succeeded for 100 years, right? The 15th Amendment, the promise of the right to vote for African Americans, was still not realized in much of the country until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we are still fighting to see that right to vote fully vindicated. So that control of the narrative of our history shapes our politics profoundly. And what Henry Louis Gates does in this essay is to link what is happening in Florida, this effort to erase African American history, to that lost cause tradition, and an intentional effort to undermine the progress towards democracy and equality. And that is the fear for me of this movement against African American history, against teaching the truth about the hard parts of our history, that it could undermine the progress of the civil rights era and set us back decades. It's very, very dangerous. And part of why it's so dangerous is that it often happens without folks' full awareness. So I mentioned the family that owned the property. We've actually built really a wonderful relationship. I would say they are friends. And we have this complicated history we share, but we are friends. But I have learned from them, in talking with them, how it was possible for them to grow up on a plantation, the quarters not 30 feet from their house, that they referred to as the quarters, but then hadn't spent very much time as a family talking about or thinking about the institution of slavery. And in fact, it's two sisters about my age. One of them invited me to speak at a meeting of the Daughters of the Confederacy, of which she is a member. And what was so interesting about the conversation is, for her, being a member of the Daughters of the Confederacy was about recognizing her ancestors and what they had done in their lives. Her ancestors went and served in the Confederacy, as did many Marylanders. Even though Maryland was on the Union side, many Marylanders who owned enslaved people went to the South to serve with the Confederate Army. And so she described it as honoring her ancestors. And I said, but do you know the history of the Daughters of the Confederacy? And she didn't really. She didn't know that they were the architects of this lost cause movement, that the Daughters of the Confederacy had worked very diligently to get textbooks adopted that would describe the Civil Wars, the War of Northern Aggression. And what I took away from that, our discussion about it, was it wasn't coming from a malevolent place. She didn't know. And that's the danger. If we don't teach an accurate history, if we don't have these hard conversations, then people will find themselves complicit in horrible systems unknowingly. And that is quite dangerous.
Just to piggyback off of what you're saying, to see DeSantis do this is not new to me. It's not a surprise. Several years ago, there was a movement in Arizona not to teach multicultural literature, right? This is not new, what's happening now, right? What I think it's about is this past Trump era. I think it's about people feeling empowered to say and do things they would have never done. I feel that people have been given license to be homophobic, to be racist, to be sexist. This moment that DeSantis is capitalizing on is that moment to push that campaign forward. Because we have so many people acting out of character, right? We're in a battle right now. The battle is not just for African American curriculum. The battle is for voice. It's for identity. It's for multiculturalism. It's for acceptance and tolerance and equity. This is a movement about power, sheerly about power. When we talk about this balance between the upper and the lower, if we think about the colonized and the colonizer, that is a power balance. If we take away African American history, we take away power. We take away voice. Again, it comes back to voice. Audre Lorde has an essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Your silence will not protect you. And that is true in every case of advocacy, of any wrong that you see. For him to make African American history illegal is one of many powerful steps to silence us, to silence history, and to break the bonds of multiculturalism. So that we can all get to understand and know each other and understand that which impacts our identity formation personally, as people of color, not people of color, but mostly Americans. This is a rewriting of American history. This is a way to get a control of it and to revise. I'm a revisionist. I talk about pre-colonial African agency. I try to dispel these myths of Africans hiding in the bushes with spears afraid of the white man when they were brokers for Europeans that came to the coast. But we don't learn that in the textbooks. And when I teach at this level, they go, why don't we know that? How come no one told us that Africans owned slaves? How come no one told us that Africans knew French, were educated? The Ethiopians had already been living in London. That is proof that we can live together, that we can operate. But more importantly, it's proof that Black people have the intellectual, the emotional capital to make things happen. And if you take away history, you take away a voice, you try to stifle a cause. And then you are also stifling what matters.
What's your thoughts about having Black History Month versus recognizing Black history throughout the year?
Yes. Look, I think it is very valuable to have Black History Month where we as a country commit to the celebration of African American history and important figures in African American history, and February is not enough time to tell those stories. And in fact, you can't tell any American story and not include the stories of African Americans. You want to talk about who served in World War I or World War II, if you want to talk about the history of the Constitution, if you want to talk about why we have the civil rights we do, you have to tell African American history in that story. You want to talk about how we built our economy, you have to tell the story of African American history. So I don't think it's an either or. I do think the danger is we can oversimplify African American history. I remember when I was secretary and Philando Castile was murdered. Philando was, he worked in the kitchen at a public Montessori school in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he was killed in an interaction with police officers, murdered by a police officer. You may remember the video. It's he was with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend's child was in the back of the car. He told the officer he had a license to have a gun, and the officer panicked and murdered him. And I went to St. Paul, Minnesota to mourn with the community of parents and educators there. And we had this conversation that was really quite powerful about how this could have happened. Because in Minnesota, people think of themselves as like Minnesota nice, right? They think of themselves as having progressive views around race. But as the people of color in the room talked about their experience living in the Twin Cities, they described the very tense relationship with the police. Philando had been stopped dozens of times by the police. And there were two moments I really remember about that conversation. One was an administrator in the school, a white woman, who was married to an African-American man. And she said to the group, I'd never interacted with the police ever in my life until I started dating my now husband. And then we got stopped all the time. And I came to understand what it's like to live here as a person of color. The other moment I really remember from the conversation was a parent who stopped me on the way out and said, I have to talk differently with my kids. It's a white parent. I have to talk differently with my kids about race, because what they've come to understand from their experience of the teaching of history is there were problems, then Martin Luther King came, then it was all better. And it's not all better. And that isn't the full story. And I have to change how we talk about this in our house. And to me, that's the risk of African American History Month being capitalized, as you said, that it can be this kind of hokey, syrupy, not real story. And I don't think that serves us well.
Well put. Yeah.
That's quite the follow-up I have to do now.
He got you back.
Got me back. He did. For the very reasons you said, and what President Sam said before, the month has been capitalized. We get a couple of infographics. Look who created this on this day. And did you know that this person said this or that? For me, as a Black American, Black History Month is every day for me. Everything that I do when I'm on this campus, when I interact with students, how I conduct myself in public, I have biracial children. So you talk about that conversation. I had to have this conversation about, well, you are biracial. You have this white family, Irish, big clan of a family. You have a very big Black clan in the family. But my children were confused about, but aren't I supposed to hate this side of the family? No, you're not. You're supposed to love who is around you, respect them, and outside of them, even if they do you wrong. I say all of that to say this. Black history, Black activism, Black agency should never be regulated to a time period. We have been having a conversation about this very thing. I was born in '72, since I'm alive. The conversation doesn't change. Living with purpose. That also means our allies. Black History Month is not just about the accomplishments of Black people, it's the accomplishments of Black Americans. And those people that assisted us in that path, that walked with us across Selma, that walked with us in different places, if we keep isolating it, right, and we say, oh, we only have this month, then what space do we give people permission to join us in learning about ourselves? When you were part of the diaspora, it took me a DNA test to learn that I was Nigerian, and been in Togo, and Congo, and Mali, well, a lot of different things, right? You know how much that hurts my heart? That my family could not tell me, we are this, we are that. This is our practice, this is our food, this is our belonging. It's gotta be every day. It's the shortest month of the year, and it's insulting. Oh, great, you gave us February, thanks. But that doesn't change and should not change how we behave as responsible human beings. And when we go into the world, we have an opportunity, you as students have an opportunity every day to be innovative, to create something, to do something different, to do something in the name of your grandparents or great-grandparents. Black History Month is every day as far as I'm concerned. It is on the path that we walk, how we treat each other, how we approach trying to understand our differences and learn from each other. A month, a year, I'm sorry. To me, it's every day. And I think we have to be more intentional about how we convey the importance of Black history, how we convey the importance of Black women. We had a movie, the Numbers movie, right? What was it called?
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures, thank you. Oh, we got a movie, great. Why are we getting more movies, more books, more speakers? Why is it just Oprah? See what I'm saying? We have to expand the representation and become our own representatives of Blackness in our everyday life. Every day is Black History Month. Every day we honor our ancestors. Every day we are creating a path forward for students and for our children, grandchildren, and their children. Every single day. I don't want the responsibility just in February and October. The responsibility is mine every day.
I'm going to ask you to tell, each of you, to tell us your favorite Black History Month factoid and why. They're not racing to go first.
I'll go first. I don't have a factory. I love peanut butter. I love potato chips. I love when the light turns green and I gotta go. I appreciate that. But I will share a Black History moment that was significant for me. Watching President Obama's inauguration, I had tears in my eyes. Not because this was a Black man being elected into office, but because my grandparents, Minnie Jones, Richard Jones, who were born in 1905 and 1910 respectively, were part of the Great Migration from down south up here, and were indentured servants. I thought about them. When you were talking about the ancestors who made it possible, my family also, my heritage, my European heritage is also from the family that owned us. My family stayed on the property to continue to work in Bedford County, Virginia. So my German, my Swedish, my Scandinavian is all part of that history. So when I'm standing there in front of my TV and I have tears in my eyes, I just kept saying, thank you, Nana and Papa. Thank you, Nana and Papa. Papa was the man who taught me etiquette, table etiquette. He said, you were not the N-word, you were a Black woman, and you're gonna act as such. And he taught me etiquette. My grandmother taught me strength, how to persevere. Like Hankston Hughes' mother to son, life had been no crystal stairs for me, but I just keep going. So for me, watching my grandparents' wildest dream come true, and being able to witness it and thank them from the depth of my heart, because it was because of them that I was where I was, to watch that moment. That's my favorite moment, aside from the peanut butter. And the chips. Yeah. Chips.
I love that. I'll take a little bit different spin on the question of there's a person who I think of whenever I think about Black history. I think about my Uncle Hal, who played a really powerful role in my life, and I think represents a lot of the stories we have to tell. So when I was a kid, both my parents passed away when I was little. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And the thing that saved me was school. School was the one place in my life that was safe and supportive and nurturing. But I struggled a lot in high school, as often happens for kids who've experienced trauma. I got in a lot of trouble, and I actually got kicked out of high school. And I imagine I know I'm the first Secretary of Education to have been kicked out of high school. I assume I'm the first Chancellor of SUNY to have been kicked out of high school. But and at that point, my life could have gone in a lot of different directions. And I went to live with my Uncle Hal, who was my father's youngest brother, who was a Tuskegee Airman, one of the first African-American pilots in the U.S. military. And I think about my Uncle Hal a lot because one of the contested issues in this moment is the nature of patriotism. Mm-hmm. And I think about my Uncle Hal because he grew up in a very segregated New York City, chose to go serve by getting trained as a pilot in Tuskegee, Alabama, where they had to check their fuel tank to make sure no one had poured water in to cause their planes to crash, because there were people who did not want Black people to be able to fly, including folks on the base who did not want Black people to be able to fly. He served in World War II. He came back from World War II and was trained as an accountant, but couldn't get a job as an accountant in New York City because he was Black. And so he chose to become a firefighter, right? So his response to the discrimination was, let me go take this job where I'm going to run into burning buildings to save people. He then went back into the military, was career Air Force. He put his flag out every day. Every day he would put out his American flag and take it back, at each night at sunset. He was deeply patriotic. He's buried at Arlington. He and the Tuskegee Airmen were American heroes, and they were also clear-eyed about the discrimination they experienced, about the discrimination they had to overcome, about the reality that their heroism was covered over and a story not told until recently. But he maintained his patriotism because of a faith in what the country could and should be. And so I worry that there's this moment now where patriotism is being defined as denying the wrongs of our history, pretending that everything has always been and is okay. That's not patriotism. Patriotism is, to me, having a critique, pushing us towards greater democracy, greater equality, while maintaining a faith that better is possible. And so when I think about African American history, I think about my Uncle Hal and folks like him who built this country with a faith that we could be better.
Well, now it's their turn. I'm going to walk around and bring the mic to whomever has a question. Before we do so, or as I move over here, I want to recognize Assemblyman Levine, who's just walked in. We're in his district, everyone, and he's always advocating for us up in Albany. Just want to recognize and thank you for being here.
Hi. So I live in a really small town in upstate New York where we don't have a lot of diversity. And I want to ask you guys what you guys think is the best way to bring Black history to an area that doesn't have any Black people to tell their stories?
That's a good question.
That's a great question.
it's an excellent question and a hard question. Two observations. One is African American history is not just for African American students, right? It's telling America's history, and so we've got to make sure, and I think it's in some ways even more urgent to make sure that we are telling those stories and sharing that history in communities that don't have diversity. The second thing I would say is, I think about a conversation I was in with President Obama and a group of students, and they asked him, what are your keys to success? And he took the question very seriously, and he gave two answers, both of which were fantastic. One was, never let anybody outwork you. And the other was reading. And he talked about it in this way, which I thought was really powerful. He said, as a person who is biracial and who has lived in many different places, I've always worked to see the world from other people's perspectives. And the power of literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is you get to see the world from other people's perspectives. You get to see the world from the worldview of the central character. You get to see the world from the perspective of the person who's sharing their memoir, their autobiography. And he said, and that ability to think about how something feels for someone who is different for you, that's how you build empathy. That's what makes you a better leader. That's what makes you a better person. And I love the way he shared that story, and I think in this moment that is even more important because that element of empathy is under attack. In Virginia, in the last gubernatorial election, there were ads run about how Toni Morrison should be banned from classrooms. And what's so dangerous about that is, if you never read Toni Morrison, right, you never get that experience of seeing the world through the eyes of the characters that Toni Morrison creates. And that, I think, diminishes all of us, but in particular, it undermines that goal of empathy. So I think there's the teaching of history, but then there's also the use of literature to help students cultivate that perspective taking and empathy.
Thank you, Chancellor. As the English lit person, I am filled with a joy. Speaking of Toni Morrison, I teach a short story called Recitative. And Recitative is made up of different vignettes of these two girls that started off in an orphanage, and then they go through life together. However, you never know exactly which one is white, which one is black. And what I love about teaching that story is I ask my students, why do we need to know which one is white, which one is black? What is it in the story that tells you which one is white, which one is black? One likes fried chicken, one likes watermelon, but you don't know who it is. Literature gives us, first of all, we study literature because it's a representation of the human condition, right? And it's a representation of the human condition on all different levels, but it's also a presentation and oftentimes a misrepresentation. So when we're looking at literature and we're analyzing it and we're trying to look at how this particular person's life has been depicted, that's an opportunity to really ask questions. Number one, like, why did Morrison choose this path? Why did Morrison make it so nebulous that we don't know who's white or who's black? The other question I would ask myself is, how am I responding to this literature? Why do I need to know who is who? And what does that say about narratives I have been told about race? Literature is for most, for me, safe, for other states not, right? But literature is an entry point so that you can just look at it at the social document it is and just ask yourself, what is this document doing? We don't know why, unless an author leaves us information to say, I wrote this because. We are only given the text, and we're only given the story that we're being told. I would say, and this goes back to why it's important to teach African American history, is to read the story and look at this representation as a human condition and start out from there. And maybe start engaging other people about, hey, there's a story about these two girls. Let's start there. And start with a conversation with a simple text and then expand outwards. But the most important thing, for a place that's not very diverse is to give yourselves permission to ask hard questions. Why do I feel this way about this character? Is it important to know what this character is going through as a person of color? Do a little of the historical research just to get some understanding, and then break it down. And then expose yourself to more cultural books and see who else is curious. And curiosity is okay. We need curiosity. Curiosity is what makes the world go round. Innovations happen, inventions happen to make our lives easier. So start from this simple place of, let's look at this story. Let's record how we feel about it, and let's have an honest conversation about why we feel the way we do. And then from there, check in with everybody and say, okay, so should we try something else? What's the next book we can read? Is it Alice Walker? Is it Octavia Butler, who writes science fiction, who doesn't necessarily come from a Black perspective, but a human perspective, but Black people are part of it? There are so many different authors that you can start with for those larger social questions, but always ask, what is this text doing? If you're watching a Jordan Peele movie, what is the movie doing? What is the commentary doing? What is the message that I'm getting? And more importantly, I tell students about this all the time, it's okay to say, this book or this movie sucked. But the real question, the scholarly question is, why? And to be able to articulate how that book or that movie failed you as a viewer, as a reader, as a human, as someone you feel very disconnected from in terms of yourself as the reader and the character. There's so many ways to get that started. Choose one and go from there. Reach out to people that do diverse work, that talk about multicultural. Reach out, have someone come and speak. It's really about voice. Again, it comes down to voice, and it comes down to, hi, would you mind having this conversation? I don't know where to start. There are so many people around that would love to tell their stories. All you have to do is reach out and say, hey, can you help me? Would you mind coming and talking? That's where I would start.
Great conversation. One of the things that I think about with what's happening in Florida, and mention how insidious it is and how dangerous it is. What do you think about two things which I think they overlap here, and it's timely in front of us, right? One, Black, centers and entities are often having to focus in spaces of color, focus on resources, right? And as everyone is focused on resources, but part of the work, a lot of times Black organizations are struggling to focus on the work because they're always having to focus on resources. And when I think about the idea of separate but equal, has never really fully been looked at, right? I think we're starting to look at the notion that when Marshall challenges, right, separate but equal, and he says you can never have institutions that are equal, that are separate and inherently equal, but that's talking about the brick and mortar, right? What happens oftentimes, which hasn't been part of the conversation, and I think it connects to resources and what's happening in dangerous fashion in Florida, is that the incubator of full nurturing and full holistic netting during Jim Crow and legal segregation and what was happening in the North often happened in these separate spaces, right? Because it was necessary. The agency to nurture, the agency to carry through. And when I think about, that hasn't been highlighted, right? The conversation, separate but equal, but what was happening in those separate spaces was offering a particular type of nurturing, which needs to be discussed, right? And not highlighting that is part of what's insidious, what's dangerous, not to be able to talk about the historiography, not to sugarcoat it, right? So I think for right now, it's awesome, amazing to have you here, both of you. But in terms of time sensitive, in terms of resources, and in terms of I want to do the work, I don't want to stop. It's okay, I want to think about resources, but how is that conversation connected to, I think, what's in front of us in so many important ways, with what's happening in Florida? I think the separate but equal thing is just a glaring example, because it's always, we say it, right? And what started on the railroad, which supposedly ended in the school systems, when we talk about legal segregation, comes to bear, I think, in many ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Dr. Lee. My name is Hyeon Lee. I'm the gallery director here at SUNY Westbury. I just wanted to, it's more of a comment than a question, but when I started working here at SUNY Westbury, every time there was a Black History Month in months of February, I thought that I should look for Black artists. So I contacted a lot of Black artists, and they, what I got, the responses were really interesting. Their least favorite months to do a show is in February. They call it, it's a month of employment. We are here for 12 months out of a whole year. Why are you looking for us only in the month of February? So finally I got somebody, Fred Holland, who became my dear friend. He now passed away. He taught me the lesson, and he eventually ended up having opening in the late January to avoid the February opening date. And then, having learned that lesson myself, I always look for Black artists other months. So we have an exhibition coming up in March. 15th is our opening date for Janet Taylor Pickett, a Black women artist. We are collaborating with the Black Studies Center for that exhibition. So anyway, I just wanted to share this episode to share that I agree with Danielle about every day is Black History Day.
That's right. I was just about to say one more question, but I'm going to let, if you're okay with it, 2 more questions. I have to get the guy with the Islanders jacket as well.
That's great. Yeah. We need more.
I have a question in regards to history. How do you think, that DeSantis' decision to try to stop the education of Black history kind of coincides with what kind of helped, like his decision on that was based off of everything that happened in 2020 with the riots and the Black Matters movement? Black Lives Matter movement, sorry.
Yes. I do think it has a lot to do with that. It's kind of what I was saying before, that this culture has now opened up to be separatist and to segregate people and to put people down, right, of all differences, if you will. I think these are decisions, though, that have been long in the making. This didn't just start with the Trump era. This has been going on, right? And I think that what happened since 2020 and the pandemic and people being completely rocked off of their foundation, we all had to learn how to cope, how to live, and we have masks and no masks and vax and no vax. It's been a state of chaos, right? And I think what DeSantis is doing is actually smart in that he's capitalizing on this chaotic moment. He's been waiting to do this, and he's not the only one. There are several waiting for their moments in other states that are planning very similar things. We're still talking about the right to marry someone you love that's the same sex. What I want you to understand is we're talking about Black history, and we're talking about the suppression of history, but we have to look at the mechanism of oppression, the mechanism of marginalization. It's larger than any one community. It's this mechanism where people in power are allowed to do this. And that speaks to why more people have to vote. That speaks to why more people have to be in the streets and advocate and educate themselves. There is no one solution, right? It's part of a scaffold, or rather I say a horrible spider web of things that have to change and happen. Is this a new idea that he's doing? Absolutely not. But I think he's capitalizing on the moment. What concerns me is how the moment is going to respond. And right now, we are all the moment. So it's up to us individually to do our due diligence, to decide what side of the moment we want to be on.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to be on the side of the moment to push back and say enough? Or are we going to not transform our silence into action and be silent and let things ride out and just complain? I think it's up to us individually to decide how we're going to do it. But this is not new, and he's not going to be the last. And there are going to be several more. And right now we have an opportunity to really think about how we are going to answer to this attack. Because if he gets successful at it, the rest of his cronies are going to go and they're going to attack everyone, not just Black people. So we have to think outside of Black. We have to think with Black. We have to think with everyone that is marginalized. Everyone that's marginalized is a target for this type of behavior or this type of action or plan that he has. Think larger, think now, and think for the future. Because we are in a really significant moment. Bless you. We are in a really significant moment right now. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. Here you go, Pete.
Yeah. Look, I would build on that just to say that there's always a strand in politics that is about tapping into people's fear and anger as a strategy. And, we just had the anniversary of the executive order that FDR issued, putting Japanese Americans into internment camps. Right? As a country, we decided in a moment of fear and panic to round up our own citizens, deprive them of their homes and liberties, and put them in internment camps because of fear, right? And that is a very powerful feature of politics. And I think we have many politicians today who are trying to tap into fear and anxiety. When people feel like their economic position is fragile, they are more susceptible to that. When people feel like there's rapid social change around them, they're more susceptible to that. And part of the danger of not teaching our history is that we repeat the thing. So, when we had the Trump administration try to impose a ban on Muslim Americans and people of Muslim faith, that was a reflection of the same impulses behind Japanese American internment. But if you never learned about Japanese American internment in school, then you wouldn't have the perspective you should about what that ban meant. And similarly, we see this backlash to the Black Lives Matter, to the summer after George Floyd was murdered, and the push towards racial justice progress. Well, we've had backlashes like that before in our history, right? Going back to the reaction to Reconstruction and the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan and the imposition of Jim Crow. That too was a backlash moment. And you have to appreciate these sort of cycles in our history so that we can try not to repeat them.
You want to stand up so they can see the Islanders?
I'm not going to stay long. First of all, my mom's friend also worked in Congress. She was, I think, for New York State. And I think it was not the Republican, but I think the Senate. I'm just going to say that. So I do appreciate the government and what everybody does in there. And you guys work very hard, so I do appreciate that. Now I'm going to get to my question, which is with the good side and the bad side of Black history, there's a lot of good and bad. So I want to know, what can we do to kind of influence or educate ourselves more to appreciate the good side and let the bad side just kind of go away digressively and just slowly, like, you know, exterminate itself so we can only have the good side of Black history come out in the future.
Why don't you start on that one?
If you wish, Chancellor. Read narratives. Start there. I recommend starting with Frederick Douglass's narratives. There are three. There are three. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, My Bondage, My Freedom, and the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And why I say to read all three of them is because he provides such an intimate perspective into not only becoming enslaved, but what that enslavement did to his family structure, the destruction of his relationship with his mother, his learning to read from white children because he had food and they did not. You learn a lot about class and a lot about balance. You learn a lot about his reception as an orator on the Lyceum circuit, the disbelief that this black man could be as eloquent and as educated as he was. Start with the narratives that tell you what happened from their perspective. Look at Sojourner Truth. Look at everything she's done, but also look at the movements that are connected with abolitionism. The women's suffragist movement that Frederick Douglass was a very big part of, as well as other abolitionists. Look for the narratives. Don't start with the big movies. Don't start with the big, simply read what they have to say. I believe it's the Library of Congress has a wealth of recorded slave narratives. I would listen to those and start from there. And the reason why I said it is start from the people that can tell you about the experience. I don't care if it's a little Equiana, fine. There's the whole thing, you didn't write it, whatever, but still. Learn from it and then start outwards. Branch out. Learn about the different social movements and why those social movements happen. But also, most important, I think, maybe not most, but equally important, is really learn about allyship. Not performative allyship, real allyship. What did it mean to march together? How many of you know that there were white people murdered for helping black people? I'm surprised. Many people mostly do not. Yes, yes. Read about allyship. Read about the supportive communities. Read about relationships. That's where you start. That's where the black history is, and then move up from there. The green, the light changing thing is fantastic. But I think to an earlier point that Professor Lee was talking about, was not to fetishize black history, not to fetishize black experience or the slave experience. Look at it as human to human. Then look at it as this was this racial dynamic that was happening. I think it's a breaking down of different components so you get a full understanding. I don't know that there's such a thing as the bad side digressing. Yin yang, black and good and bad are interconnected. And when it comes to diaspora, to genocide, to marginalization, to the murder of people, just for difference, there is no such thing as the bad side going away because we have way too many families that are still mourning their losses, that are still mourning different acts of discrimination against them.
No bad side. It's no bad side.
Right.
You gotta see it all.
You have to see it, you have to see it all. You absolutely have to see it all. Your turn.
Wow. We should applaud that first. I agree with that completely. And the one thing I would note, and Henry Louis Gates raises this in the op-ed I mentioned, is that we should also see African American history as complex. There were debates throughout that history. It's not tidy, right? Du Bois and Booker T. Washington had different views about the role that education should play in the advancement of the African American community, right? There were differences during the Civil Rights Movement, not only between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but between Martin Luther King and others within the more traditional civil rights movement about how fast, where to go, which, if you read Parting the Waters, right, you see that it wasn't tidy, it was messy, that Dr. King is sitting around with other leaders in the civil rights movement debating which city should we go to next? Is this progress that we're making enough in this city, or should we demand more? Are we too close to the Johnson administration? Right, so these things are contested. Even in the summer after the murder of George Floyd, there was a robust debate, right? That people want to oversimplify with slogans like defund the police, but there was a real debate within the activist community about how much to demand of police departments, what level of change is necessary, what is the role of incarceration in a democratic society. And so if we do African American history well, if we do history well, we see its complexity. If we read literature well, we see its complexity, right? And my hope is that part of what students come away with from their experience at Old Westbury is a comfort with that complexity and ability to think critically, to see the world from different perspectives, to challenge ideas and try to get behind them and understand the rationale. That's what higher education's mission is.
Well, Chancellor and Assistant Professor, I want to thank you. I just want to note, Chancellor, that just a shameless plug for our evolving social and environmental justice institute. I think what you've just concluded with is exactly why we're forging ahead with the institute, to make sure that every one of our students have that critical ability to interrogate the literature, to interrogate the national politics and everything in between, and to make conscious decisions around justice and around how we save our planet. And so next time you come, I'm going to give you an update on our Social Environmental Justice Institute, and certainly we're going to invite you back to give another conversation. And I'm going to ask you when you come back to speak about this. It is the case that in 20, 30 years, maybe a little shorter, there'll be books written about you, right?
Yep.
Me knowing you, I know you're conscious about that. What does it mean every day for you to walk in this space, in this time, being a Black history maker, being a history maker, and what are the kinds of responsibilities you feel associated with that? Now, you can start answering that now, and we can walk out on that point. Or you can hold off and say, I'd rather hold off, and come back and give us a sense of that.
That's the next conversation.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much for being here.